This week on Nothing But the Truth, we're joined once again by Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a former terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Treasury, and one of the most trusted voices on the Middle East, Iran, and U.S. foreign policy. He was with us just last week as the war between Israel and Iran was erupting, and now we're speaking in the wake of a truly historic moment. After 12 days of intense fighting with missiles flying, Israel defending itself on multiple fronts, and the region on edge, President Trump made a bold and unprecedented decision. The U.S. launched targeted strikes on 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities, and according to reports, those facilities were destroyed. For the first time in a generation, the global threat of a nuclear Iran may no longer be hanging over the world. This isn't just another chapter in the Iran-Israel saga. It could be a turning point, a shift in the trajectory of the Middle East, and a recalibration of power on the global stage. Did the U.S. succeed in permanently crippling Iran's nuclear program? What does this mean for Israel, for Iran's regime, and for the region moving forward? And what role will America play in shaping what comes next? We need to go through all of these issues one by one, and thankfully, Jonathan Schanzer is with us again to break it all down. Jonathan, welcome back to Nothing But the Truth.
Great to be with you.
So we just went through a couple of different scenarios of what could happen, none of which being that President Trump would actually send in the F-2 bombers and bomb the 3 nuclear sites. I guess that means we're living in very unbelievable, fast-moving, unpredictable times. I want to know, firstly, do you think that the bombing campaign was truly successful in wiping out Iran's nuclear capability? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm bullish right now. I know that it's been sort of a little up and down in terms of the assessments that we've been getting, from the administration, and then from apparently the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency. We heard Trump say that the program was obliterated. Then we heard Pete Hegseth 12 hours after the attack. I think add to that, maybe in some more muted terms. But he seemed to be very happy about, the way that this strike was executed. Then we had the DIA come out, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and issue this report saying that it may have only been months and that it may not have been as successful of a strike as had been previously hoped. My sense right now, based on the conversations that I've been having with folks, is that this program is set back for a long time. I don't want to say obliterated because I don't think that's the right word to use. I do think that there could be elements of the program that were not hit. There could be, we've been hearing about the potential of loose enriched uranium that is unaccounted for, 60% enriched uranium. That's not weapons grade, but it's, it's uranium that's been enriched to the point where one more sort of round in the process would actually get it to weapons grade. But I don't see the Iranian regime capable right now of spinning like enough centrifuges to get this done. I don't see the conversion facilities that would have changed the gas to metal. And look, I am not a nuclear scientist. I don't even play one on TV. I don't want to pretend that I understand all of the complexities of the technicals involved here. I leave that to people who are much smarter than I am. I was never a STEM guy, just, full disclosure. But from what I understand, massive damage was done. The weapons that were dropped, these massive ordnance penetrators that the B-2s dropped on Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan, they worked. They did immense damage. Does it mean that it's permanent? No, there's no such thing as permanent, right? I mean, the Iranian regime, if it decides that it wants to go back at it again, they can start to try to reconstitute. But let me just also say that the Israelis can still fly right into Iranian airspace right now, right? I mean, there's no missile defense getting in their way, and they can do what they did for 12 days, which is to have complete and total air superiority. and they're watching the regime like a hawk right now. Same for the United States. And you've heard Donald Trump say that they're never going to enrich again. And that was his promise. Now, obviously, that promise only lasts for about 3.5 years, but 3.5 years is pretty good. I'll take that. And I'll also just say that I think the Israelis will be watching well past 3.5 years. So I see this regime reeling as a result of the 12 days of bombardments. The Israelis nailed a lot of assets of this regime. They are going to be licking their wounds for a long time, and that nuclear program, that illicit nuclear program, I think is going to take a long time to reconstitute if they have the will, and I'm not sure they do. So I look, it's not mission accomplished, but it is one hell of a mission.
So, two questions I have about just the mission before I move on. One, there are people who are saying that there are videos of trucks leaving the Fordo facility in advance of the strike. So, does that mean that these centrifuges were taken away? And if so, what does that mean? Like, where could they be taken, and what could be done with them?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're talking about, everyone's been talking about this sort of BDA, the battle damage assessment, and a lot of it is obviously focused on the strikes themselves and what did they destroy, and did the ceiling of Fordo crash to the floor, in this facility that's underground, that was under, hundreds of meters of rock and mountain and concrete. And I do think that that's an important thing to look at, because the Hall of Cascades, as it's known, um, you know, hopefully was destroyed. There are these reports, and by the way, the reports are probably maybe made even a little more worrisome when we hear that the United States gave Iran advance warning of the strike that was coming, and that may have prompted the regime to line up these trucks, and to spirit away some of this enriched uranium. That's possible, right? We're hearing that it's, I don't know, 400 kilograms or 600 or 800. Again, I'm not the technical guy here, and nor do I have any unique knowledge of what may have happened. It's possible that the regime got away with some enriched uranium. But again, I've got to ask, what good is it when they don't have, the Israelis killed 14 nuclear scientists that were involved in this program. They took out the administrators of this program. They took out the IRGC officials, the Revolutionary Guard officials that were, overseeing the program and trying to secure it. The conversion facility at Isfahan that would allow this uranium to be turned into metal to be used in a warhead, that's been destroyed. So, we may have seen the movement of this material and we may not be able to account for it. But when you ask, like, whether this is something that poses a direct threat right now, it's really hard for me to understand what the theory of the case is for, gosh, this mission failed, and Iran is still on the offensive with its nuclear program. I'm personally not seeing it. And look, there could be some kind of black swan event that could prove it all wrong. And Trudy, you and I have talked a bunch of times over this war, and there are things that we are just unable to predict and unable to see. And I'm comfortable with that, because I just, all I can do is read and talk to people and listen and try to pull in the information. The information that I'm getting right now is that this was an overwhelming success, not 100% success. There are things that, are still unaccounted for, but by and large, it really does look like the Israelis did, 75% of the work bombing targets above ground. And then the United States came in, dropped, a bunch of weapons that ended up destroying the vast majority of the nuclear infrastructure. And I do believe that it's going to be a hard one to come back from.
Well, that is really great news. Great news to hear. The question I have next is: was the ceasefire that President Trump insisted upon premature? It's not only the nuclear program. Obviously, the nuclear program is, existential, but the ballistic missiles are doing a lot of damage also. Is what is the capability, the ballistic missile capability at this moment? And should Israel have been able to really uh, take more of those out?
Yeah. It's a great question, and look, I'm a little torn. My understanding is the Israelis had maybe another couple of days of strike packages that they were interested in targeting, and I think after Trump did what he did, I think his kind of indication was we're all done here. Like, I've done what I said I was going to do. I said to the world that Iran was not going to get a nuclear weapon. I gave them 60 days. They didn't comply within 60 days of these negotiations in Oman. And then I gave a green light for the Israelis to start attacking. And when they cleared the path for our B-2 bombers, we took the path, we dropped the bombs, and now the crisis is over. The crisis isn't over for Israel. I think we can say that with certainty, but it's kind of over for the United States, right? Unless the Iranians decide they want to open this again and attack the United States, with missiles or drones or asymmetric attacks or lone wolf or sleeper cells or whatever, the scenario might be. But I got to tell you, that sounds like suicide to me for the regime. I mean, if they decide to do that and to provoke the United States, I got to say Donald Trump is unpredictable on a good day. You mess with him, in this way as a sort of a response to the attacks that the U.S. carried out. I can just, it's not hard to scramble those B-2s again, and to drop more weapons. And so that leaves the Israelis sort of, I don't want to say alone because they're not alone, right? I mean, the United States came to Israel's aid, and it was unprecedented what had happened here. The United States and Israel in a joint operation taking out Iran's nuclear program. The Israeli phase was the 12-day one, and then it culminated with the US dropping those B-2s, and that was a hell of a punctuation mark. At the end of this 12-day operation. So it's not like Israel's alone, but Israel's going to have to grapple with what comes next. And it is primarily Israel's problem. Maybe it's a regional problem too, because you've got, the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and all the other countries that are still afraid of the Iranian regime because the regime is still sponsoring terror proxies. They still have a ballistic missile program. They might have elements of a nuclear program that they may try to reconstitute. These threats are not insignificant. But I do think that it's a question of, was this Trump's, was this his responsibility? So if you ask me right now, there is a couple of roads in front of us. One is that the regime capitulates, right? They surrender. I don't think that's going to happen. I think there's less than a 5% chance, maybe even less than a 1% chance. And we've
Well, what do you mean they would surrender?
yeah,
Surrender to who?
basically say we were defeated and we want an agreement with Israel and the United States. We don't want to fight anymore, and we want guarantees for our safety so that we can rebuild our country and lick our wounds and start over. But that would mean like admitting defeat, which I don't think the Islamic Republic is going to do. Right? When you surrender and you try to, you try to have a new agreement with your enemies, that means that you've capitulated. It means that you're waving the white flag. And this Islamic Republic I don't think it can be the Islamic Republic if it cedes defeat to Israel and the United States, the great Satan and the little Satan. They just can't do it, right? Like mentally, they don't have they cannot justify doing this and then still remaining in power and still saying that they are the Islamic Republic and they're trying to spread revolution around the Middle East. It just doesn't seem like something that, we can't square the circle. That's
Well, wait. I do think though that the real big question comes: is Khamenei alive?
So I've seen reports as of today that, there are statements coming out from him. I don't think anybody's seen him. But I guess we're gonna have to wait. We're gonna have to wait and see. This is something I can't predict. I don't think there have been no videos of him emerging from his bunker. But let me play through the other scenarios that we have here because I think they're relevant to your question. Um, so they don't capitulate, they don't surrender. Okay, fine. Then I think, and let's just say that Khamenei is alive, just for the sake of argument. So, what are the other options that we have? One is, and you've seen this, that the crown prince of the former regime in Iran, the pre-79 regime of Iran, comes out in Paris and he says, Iranian people, rise up. This is your moment. Take your country back. So there's that kind of option, let's say, for the
That's Pahlavi.
yes, Reza Shah Pahlavi, right? And he says, go out and rise up. I don't know what kind of power he has. I don't know what kind of mobilization this guy's capable of. Be amazing to see the hundreds of thousands, millions of people coming out into the streets of Iran and bringing down the regime. I don't know how to game that out. I would be thrilled if that was something that was feasible, especially if the Iranian people would be able to unite in kind of one voice. All the sort of sectarian and ethnic and religious sort of differences of the country are erased overnight, and everybody comes together in common pursuit of the great Iranian or Persian nation. As Donald Trump famously tweeted, make Iran great again. I definitely want to get a hat or a t-shirt or something, right? But so I don't know how to game it out, but I think it's also probably a low probability, not as low as, capitulation or surrender, but I'm not convinced that right now that the Iranian opposition is ready. By the way, they don't trust us. We have failed them so many times in the United States when they've risen up against the regime, and we have failed to come to their aid. We have failed to provide them the support. And this is a bipartisan accusation I'm making here. I think that Republicans and Democrats alike have failed the Iranian people, and they know it, and they're not sure that they can trust us, and they don't think that we're going to have their back. And I'm not surprised. So let's put that scenario aside. I think there is a real scenario where there are mid-level ranks of the Revolutionary Guard or mid-level clerics that have a following that look at what Khamenei just did, right? And he was sitting there waging war and spending billions of dollars on proxies and nuclear programs and he just got shellacked. And in like very clear ways, he was just beaten down, and there is no coming back from the defeat that he has just suffered. And it does raise the question whether somebody basically says, "Hey, you had your shot, you missed it. Now it's time for somebody else, and we're pushing you out, old man. Your time's up." And you see some other person come in, and maybe they're not, Zionists, and maybe they're not, supporters of the United States, but maybe, just maybe, they are pragmatic. Maybe they don't want war with Israel or the United States. Maybe they truly want to make Iran great again. And they start looking inward and they look to actually rebuild the country in a way that doesn't put them at odds with the entire region. I sort of look at it this way, like if you think about what just happened in Syria, right? You have a nasty guy that is running the country, right? Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, right? This guy is a dirtbag of the highest order, right? Al-Qaeda, right? For years. But he doesn't want to mess with Israel right now. I mean, the guy's actually talking about normalization because he knows that his country's weak and he knows that he can't trifle with the Israelis right now. There's a possibility that we see some kind of internal dissent that brings about, by the way, it could be somebody who's pragmatic, it could be somebody that's more radical. Hard for me to imagine somebody more radical than what we just had. Really hard for me to imagine. You can't get much worse than the regime that we just saw. Maybe you could, but it's really hard for me to get my head wrapped around a more genocidal and more suicidal regime than what we just witnessed in Iran that just got, beaten down. Now, the last scenario, Trudy, is I think the one that I probably ascribe the highest percentage to, at least for right now, just as I'm viewing this, where you don't have internal revolution, you don't have external factors bringing down the regime, you don't have surrender. right? None of those scenarios that I just walked you through, that none of them play out. Then what you have is basically what the Israelis are doing in places like Syria and Lebanon and perhaps other parts of the Middle East, which is the Israelis have capabilities. They can act whenever they want. And what you have is this uneasy calm that you're living in the gray area, not peace, not war. Calm and vigilance on the part of Israel. And if they need to, just as they do in Lebanon on a regular basis, just as they do in Syria on a regular basis, if they see a threat, they attack and they neutralize threats as they emerge. And right now, again, the Iranians, they can't stop the IDF from coming in. There are no air defenses. There still are not. The dominance that Israel displayed over 12 days, I mean, the Iranians did not control their own airspace. They were not the air traffic controllers of their own country. I mean, just imagine that another country controls the airspace of the United States and that we would have to ask some country like Canada or Mexico, can we please send a plane out of our airspace? That's what the Iranians had to do as they were trying to engage in diplomacy with the Europeans. The foreign minister had to request permission from the Israelis to leave his own airspace, right? So the Israelis can go back whenever they want. Now, the only thing that I have heard, and I think this is a real concern, if the Israelis say, yes, we're going to attack anything we don't like, the threshold is going to be very high because the Israelis have just come out of 12 days of sustaining 500 ballistic missiles. And I'll tell you, Trudy, I was in Israel at the beginning of this war. And I got to tell you, I mean, the 4 or 5 days that I was on the ground and watching these missiles come in and the lack of sleep and the lack of security that the entire country felt. And I felt it too. I was relatively safe. I was in Jerusalem, which wasn't getting a lot of these missiles, but it's not something that anybody in Israel wants to go through again. And so the idea of going back in with those F-35s and bombing again, knowing that you could get hit by the regime, the Israelis are going to think twice too. And so what I look at right now is an uneasy calm that appears to be settling over the region right now, and everyone is trying to decide what their next move is.
It is such an unusual moment in history. And I think really a lot cannot be gamed with not knowing whether or not the regime is going to stay put and Khamenei at the lead, or if Pahlavi is going to come in, or if some other cleric is going to come in. I think those are the three things that you laid out. And without that, it's almost impossible. Like, my next thought that I had was, what kind of retaliation should we expect here in the United States? They say sleeper cells. I saw warnings that if you're a United States citizen traveling abroad, to be very vigilant. My own brother happens to be in London right now, and I was texting him, really watch out. But the thing is, the retaliation would depend on who's actually, at the helm.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah, and look, again, we're this is all sort of theoretical. I think what we need to remember, though, is that this regime, they're the sponsors of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and a bunch of terrorist groups in Iraq and previously in Syria. But then they also, they've got lone wolves that they've been sort of engaging around the Europe and the United States. They've got sleeper cells. I mean, I can tell you, I'm familiar with some of these capabilities from when I was in government. Not that we saw them ever activated, but there was a lot of suspicion of possible sleeper cell activity in the United States after 9/11. I'm going to assume that they're still there. I don't have any special knowledge of this, but there was concern back then, and I'm assuming that there's still concern because Iran's regime hasn't changed and their capabilities haven't changed. I'm actually more concerned about freelancers is kind of the way that I would describe it, right? I mean, we have seen the regime try to enlist crime families, kind of mafia types and gangs to try to carry out attacks against Israeli and American figures in the United States. these plots have been disrupted. In places like Sweden, we have seen the regime recruit kids that are like high school age to try to attack the Israeli embassy and, shoot at the facility, things like that. That's the stuff that I think we need to be more concerned about. Stuff where there's going to be plausible deniability on the part of the regime, where they hire some kid and pay him a couple $100 to try to carry it. And this is not going to be particularly professional, right? Same thing with the crime families. You're going to have a varying degree of professionalism for hits that might be contracted. And I don't think that the vast majority would be successful, but I do think there's, a low probability chance that something occurs because this regime is still this regime. And they, as long as they're still in power right now, I'm concerned. It may change with circumstances on the ground. And again, I'm watching very carefully to see the kind of the trajectory of this regime after the beating that it just took. I think you're going to see the regime try to look defiant, try to project strength, but I think try is the operative word here. I don't think they have that strength. And I do think that the perception that they got spanked by the Israelis is important here. Just so everybody understands what just occurred. The Israelis, right, have a small air force and they are a tiny country of 10 million people, the size of New Jersey, if not a little smaller. Their air force flew 1,000 miles into Iran, which is a country of 90 million people, twice the size of the state of Texas, and they dominated for 12 days in a row. And they controlled the airspace and they bombed military sites and IRGC sites and nuclear sites and economic and production facilities. And I mean, the scope of this operation was insane. And there is no way that the Iranian regime can claim victory with all of the things that were exploding all over the place. They can try to pick out pictures and images and video from the Israeli media that shows that, that some of the ballistic missiles fell on Israel. Okay, I got to tell you, Israel's, I mean, let me put it this way. The people that were projecting what would happen in Israel as a result of this war are thrilled. They thought that it was going to be thousands of people dead and tens of thousands of people wounded and trillions of dollars of damage. What we're looking at is 29 people killed. And I got to say, I mean, I'm not minimizing the deaths, horrific, right? And I mourn for the families and I nothing but sympathy for them. They had, around 1,000 injuries. I mean, we're talking about 10% of the damage that they had projected. The Israelis came out about as good from this as you could possibly imagine, and the Iranians are reeling. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to stay on this trajectory, but it's really hard for me to understand how the regime is going to project victory here. Really hard.
So do you see the regional landscape totally shifting and with an expansion of the Abraham Accords, realignment of the Middle East based on this, even if the regime is in power still?
Not yet. Not yet. Um, I think that there is a chance that Lebanon joins the Abraham Accords, and I understand that the mechanism that exists right now between Lebanon and Israel to coordinate continued strikes and the continued weakening of Hezbollah, it's going really well, and I think there's infrastructure there, dating back to October now, so we've got 7, 8, 9 months of runway, and that feels pretty good to me. Um, some interactions that I've had with Lebanese officials and Israeli officials give me a sense of moderate confidence that things are going in the right direction. Um, I've heard about Syria being a candidate for normalization. I gotta say, I mean, I'd love to see it. It feels a little premature to me. I'm not saying don't do it, but I am saying that this guy, this this, jihadi Al-Qaeda leader. Um, he went from being a complete animal to being a pragmatic leader of a country. It happened overnight. And I think that his constituents are jihadists and Al-Qaeda and ISIS and foreign fighters. And for him to march into Jerusalem and shake hands with Bibi Netanyahu might be a little bit more than his regime is willing to absorb. And I'm watching attacks that have taken place. Yesterday there was one in Syria that took place against the church. And it's not clear right now who carried out this attack. And it's possible that it's a splinter group of Ahmad al-Shara, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani. It's possible that it's a splinter of his regime. And that would be a sign that things are not stable. And so, I want stable peace. I want to see that if normalization, occurs, that it's sustainable and that there's a structure that's going to support it, and it's not just one guy. And if one guy gets whacked, that we're set back by 20 years. So, I mean, I'm concerned. I mean, I'm not saying don't normalize, but I am saying this one feels a little premature. By the way, it was premature to remove the sanctions on Syria. It's premature to be optimistic about Syria. I mean, this is really fluid over there. But the big one that everyone's watching is Saudi Arabia, right? I don't think the Saudis move in this direction until the regime is gone. Because the regime, if it still has ballistic missiles and it still has certain capabilities and it can still attack, Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, and it can still, stir up unrest in the eastern province of Saudi. I mean, there are all these things that the Iranian regime has done in the past to undermine the Saudis. I don't think they feel, I don't think they feel confident or ready to take a step in this direction. And you can see it with the statements. Like they condemned Israel's operations against the Islamic Republic, not because they love Iran, right? They truly they have this, this contest, this sectarian contest, and they really feel like they're at odds with one another. Um, and I think that they're just waiting for the coast to be clear. And I don't think that we have the all clear yet. And I do think that, we were talking about Donald Trump and what he does next. And, if there's one thing that might motivate Donald Trump to go back in and to potentially, take out additional Iranian assets, it would be that. Because the man, had started down the road of normalization with Saudi and Israel. It was disrupted by the Biden presidency. And, I think that he'd love to get back to exactly where he was because he had the Saudis on the 5 yard line. I don't think they're on the 5 yard line right now because of the concerns they have about potential threats from the regime.
So I actually think this comes back to the very first question, or second question, was the ceasefire premature? And maybe the answer actually after this full analysis is yes, it was. That had Israel been able to continue to take out the rest of the ballistic missile capability, normalization might have followed.
Yeah, but I don't think, Trudy, that Israel had the capability of taking out all of the ballistic missiles. My understanding is that right now there's probably about, I don't know, 1,200, 1,500 missiles left out of the 2,500 that the regime started with. And I'm giving you like back of the envelope kind of numbers because I don't have any, like exclusive knowledge here. They had something like 600 or 700 ballistic missile launchers. Now they're down to like 300, let's say. And again, all back of the envelope. They weren't going to get the rest of them. Like not all of them. There was just no way. Now, how many of those ballistic missiles are capable of hitting Israel? That they have the sort of advanced capabilities, the aim, etc. I mean, I think they probably used some of the better ones in their war against Israel. I think the Israelis did a lot to prevent additional attacks. So shooting them down, maybe even striking them on the launchers, possibly hacking them on launchers. There's lots of different things that happened that I think helped Israel neutralize the threat, but the threat's not gone, and I don't think that another 3 days of fighting would have changed all that. But it does kind of raise the question of, and this is what's about to happen in, I think it's either Doha or in Muscat, right? In either Qatar or Oman. As I understand it, there's going to be direct talks between Iran and the United States. And I think they're going to try to arrive at some kind of new understanding. A lot of people are concerned that, we're not going to make all the right demands. I think this all hinges on what Donald Trump tells Stephen Witkoff. It all hinges on what, the president says, this is what I'm telling you that I need, and I need you to do it. And if it's just, okay, we're all going to agree that we're going to stop fighting, then no, then we're not ending this on the right terms. If it, and again, this gets back to this idea of surrender or capitulation. And this is what I'm watching for. I think it's low probability that the regime agrees to capitulate, where they say, yes, we're going to end our ballistic missile program. Yes, we're going to stop funding our proxies. Yes, we're going to end the nuclear program, and we are going to become a normal country that is not at war with its neighbors. That's the ideal. And that's what I'd love to see. But I mean, again, I think we have to ask ourselves, is that in the nature of this regime? I think the answer is no. And then if the answer is no, then the question is, do we have enough leverage? Does the United States and maybe Israel, maybe the rest of the world, is there enough leverage there to force the regime to capitulate nonetheless? I'm, look, I'm very bullish on what happened, right? I think that the United States and Israel, they've done unbelievable work together in unprecedented cooperation between our two countries, and there's a huge amount to be proud of on both sides of the Atlantic. Um, but where we go from here, hard to game out. I think we've talked about those four pathways. I would love it if we saw full surrender on the right terms, and that all of this came to an end. But I'll just say this, kind of one last note. The Israelis, they could have tried to keep fighting. I think there were two things getting in their way. One was Donald Trump. I mean, and we saw how angry he was when the Israelis were ready to strike after being after the ceasefire came into effect. I mean, he's dropping F-bombs and he's snarling at Bibi, and I mean, he was furious that Bibi was even on his way to doing this, because he was saying, this is the ceasefire, you must abide, right? Um, and I think there's the other part of this too, which is, did the Israelis have enough interceptors to keep going for another 4 or 5 days? Did they have enough to defend against, the ballistic missiles? Again, no joke, these things. These are missiles the size of a bus with 500 to 1,000 pounds of explosive material, blowing up entire buildings, taking out city blocks, right? And you see the video. And so, you could say that it was premature. I like to deal with reality as I see it. And I think the Israelis were probably feeling like they were ready to wrap it up. I think the Iranians were ready to wrap it up. Trump wanted everybody to wrap it up. And so they wrapped it up.
Okay. How does all of that impact the war in Gaza? We still have hostages there. 7 soldiers were killed yesterday in Khan Yunis. How does this impact that war?
Um, Look, I think theoretically, uh, Hamas is far more isolated than it was 12, 15 days ago. Um, I I already was under the distinct impression that Hamas was a shell of itself. It's funny, behind me on my bookshelf here, I've got one of those decks of cards that an Israeli friend gave me when I went there like 3 months after the 10/7 attacks. And it was, it's a deck of cards of all the Hamas guys they wanted to kill. We had them, we had the same kind of deck of cards after the invasion of Iraq and Saddam Hussein's regime, and it was the high value targets. If I'm not mistaken, out of the 52 um, figures on in my deck of cards. I believe two of them are still alive.
Wow.
Two. Okay. They're a spent force. I mean, the people that are still fighting, I mean, yes, they're still able to carry out attacks against Israeli soldiers. And yes, they're still, hijacking aid as it's coming in. But by and large, these are like kids with AK-47s and RPGs. They don't have a lot of rocket capabilities left. The tunnel system's getting, steadily picked apart. It's urban warfare. It's asymmetric warfare. And I do have to ask at this point what the Israelis get out of continued fighting. I understand they're trying to get back the hostages, but I'm not sure that fighting at this point is going to get them back any sooner than not fighting, right? I mean, it feels like we're heading into a stalemate here as it relates to the Gaza war. And it's funny, I've floated something. I don't know if it's a stupid idea or a good idea. I'll float it here for you and you can tell me what you think. But, I think the Israelis are coming under a lot of pressure for, to end the war in Gaza from Europeans and the United States and the Arabs. People are just they're tired of it and they're done. And the Israelis are saying, no, 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 we got 50 hostages, we got to get them out. Um, What if the Israelis said we're ending our fight right now because we've just won. We beat your patron. No other, none of the other proxies lifted a finger against us as we operated in 12 days. We beat the Axis, and that includes Hamas. Now, we still have a problem though, right? We need our hostages out. And here's the deal. We're going to control the borders 100%. Nothing gets in or out without Israeli approval. Um, there's not going to be any fighting. But here's the thing. There's also not going to be one scrap of reconstruction material that comes in. And so Gaza, you have a choice. You can either return the hostages and get them all out and then start to rebuild your territory. And you'll make decisions about Hamas, which Israel can still continue to destroy from the air or the ground, but give them the opportunity to make the decision without the ongoing war, which is at this point, again, I feel like we've reached a point of diminishing returns. It's not to say they can't kill another 100 or 200 or 500 Hamasniks. They can, but I got to ask, like, is there real benefit to it at this point? You look, I mean, my last trip to Israel, not the one where I spent the entire time in a bunker, but the one that I was in April, I went to the Gaza border and the person I was with gave me his binoculars, and I surveyed the Gaza Strip, the top half, the northern half of the Gaza Strip, and I mean it looks like a zombie movie, right? I mean it is just it is in ruin. And I just don't know what's left other than to go house to house looking for people who are shooting at the Israelis and then for the Israelis to fire back. And that just doesn't sound like a strategic war to me. It sounds like one that probably has very little benefit to Israel long term. Now, I could be absolutely wrong here, and I know that there'll be Israelis who tell me, it's not your kids that are being held in the tunnels in Gaza, and you have I readily see that. But what I can say is I'm very sensitive right now to the fact that Israelis are exhausted. I'm sensitive to the fact that the Israelis have won, and I don't want to see them turn a win into a loss by going back into Gaza and getting stuck there. That would be the worst way to end what has just happened. I want to see I want to see Israel start to wrap this up on its own terms. And honestly, if they said we're not fighting for a month, and Stephen Witkoff, you get a month to get our hostages out. You can negotiate this. We're not letting anything in for reconstruction. We're going to let the minimal amount of food and assistance come in, but ball's in your court now. Let us know how it goes. In the meantime, we're taking a breather.
Well, I think that's a great suggestion, and I would love to see that happen. I would love to see them say, okay, here are the 50 hostages, 20 some odd alive. You could have them, and let's just call it quits. I would love to see that. I think the hostage piece is the biggest wound here and the real raw piece. And that is just so devastating to just you can't Israel cannot walk away with 50 people or some of 22 people still alive. They just can't do that.
Can't do it. 100%. But I think that, again, the way that they've been doing it, look, it worked. Um, and now I'm just questioning whether it's still working, right? I mean, they destroyed the threat and they got a lot of hostages out through negotiations and through rescue, and the recovery of bodies and all of that. And I think, Israel has a lot to be proud of, but urban warfare is a complicated thing.
Well,
And yeah,
I would love to see your suggestion being utilized. I hope that this podcast is so widely listened to that the right people listen to it and take your suggestion, because I think it's a really good one. And I think it could end this getting back our hostages and just moving on in such a
yeah,
good way. As always, Jonathan, thank you so much for your clarity, your insight, your depth. This is a moment unlike anything we've ever seen in recent years. It's historic, as you said. The bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities, the Trump brokered ceasefire, the shifting regional dynamics. It's left the world asking, what now? What next? And you've helped us understand not just what happened, but why it matters for Israel, for the Middle East, and for global security. Thank you so much for coming on and helping us through this very complicated historic moment. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
my pleasure.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us. This has been Nothing But the Truth with Trudy Stern. You can catch us every Thursday at 9:30 p.m. on the radio. And if you missed any part of the show or want to listen to any of our past episodes, you can find Nothing But the Truth wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, stay strong, stay informed, and keep seeking nothing but the truth.